Now, the evolution of VR is really interesting because it's it's something that has gone on for longer than sometimes you might realize. Um, a lot of people look at it right now and think, okay, VR, early VR was basically like the Oculus, right? The DK1, um, and there's like the Vive. It goes way further back than that, with a large gap in between. Um, but let me see. Oops, sorry. So we've got a fairly long history, sort of long evolutionary history. We've gone from, you see in the top over here. Um, this was, I'll talk a bit about this later, but Dactyl VR. This was actually in the 90s. All right, it was just early in the 90s. We had a VR experience, and this was a very simple experience. It was a very rudimentary experience, and we've gone all the way to things like Half-Life Alyx, which is a very immersive game that you've got presence of your hands, you're touching things, you're grabbing objects, and you've got a very visually compelling experience, which is a far cry from what you're seeing up top. So I've broken this down into sort of like prehistory, history, and now. So the prehistory, what you're seeing over here on the right is Dactyl Nightmare. This came out in this was, I think, the early 90s. This was so Antovani and Sean mentioned or talked a bit earlier about about Sean's sort of like introduction or the first experience with immersive technologies. This was mine. Like back in the early 90s, going out to the arcade and seeing this thing, right? I was used to your cabinet arcades or just pressing buttons and fiddling with a joystick. I see this thing and I'm like, what is this, right? Um, it was a game called Dactyl Nightmare. I think there was another one with a similar hardware, but Dactyl Night was one everyone actually remembers. It was this, by today's standards, this horribly low frame rate, ugly, um, thing with barely any gameplay. You're just kind of running around. There was no, you didn't have a thumbstick. You just had like a one button on your thumb, which moved you forward. Um, and then you had this trigger that would shoot these horrible things at this flying pterodactyl thing. Um, and again, by today's standard, it looks horrible. It was horribly low frame rate. Um, but at the time it was amazing, right? You've got this headset, you're fully immersed in this incredibly low poly world. But you look around, I'm looking around, it's tracking my head. I'm moving around, and I've got this thing around me to make sure I don't fall down. But you're walking around, you're in this world compared to this flat screen that you normally see in front of you, compared to this joystick. You've got this gun that you're holding, and it's actually floating around in front of you, and you're kind of aiming and shooting. And it was incredibly cool. Um, Now, of course, back then it was expensive, right? Both for consumer. I don't remember how much it cost per try, but my parents weren't really happy whenever I went to try it because it was pretty expensive compared to any other arcade game. Development was obviously really expensive because it wasn't something that was available to just everybody, right? You've got this specific hardware that's I don't know how much it cost, but it was probably incredibly expensive. And there was no software, there was no research that's already been done to kind of help you along. So it just had there was this game and there's one other game by the same company. Um, it was inaccessible again, hardware, software, and everything was really underpowered. Like I said, frame rate was really low. Like you could see the frames kind of pop in. One other thing, so this is a little bit different, but um, again, this is back in the day. This was, I think, late 80s. There was also 3D glasses. Um, this would this is sort of like the precursor, which would use shutter glasses to kind of give you a kind of a depth, like a depth view of your TV. And this is one of those things where like the old 3D movies where stuff would come out at you. Um, so this was again um, very underpowered, uh, but still pretty cool for the time. So then we've got the history, relatively recent history. There was a long gap between Dactyl Nightmare and Oculus kind of coming into things and Palmer Luckey and all that stuff. So I want to say prior to a couple of years ago, VR was a lot more accessible than it was in the early 90s. It was still accessible. I mean, sorry, it was still expensive. Um, both for consumers and developers, for a couple of reasons. The hardware itself, like a VR headset, was starting to get more affordable, especially with Oculus, the DK1. I think I paid about 400 USD for the developer kit. So it was relatively affordable, but you're still tethered to a computer. You still needed good hardware to run your VR experiences just because of the specific requirements of VR. You need a high frame rate, otherwise you start getting a little nauseous. Um, you're running two separate displays, right? So you're not rendering like a single, like let's say back in the day, like 1280 by 720 or like 1080p. You're kind of running that but twice. So you still needed a lot of hardware to get into both development and consumption. You're not going to get a cheap PC and a headset and start, playing Doom in VR or something. You still need a powerful PC. So it was relatively inaccessible, um, but it was still consumer accessible. You could still get a good gaming PC and a good hard graphics card and headset and start playing or developing. The technology and the techniques are still nascent. There's a lot of research that started happening um, on how to move in VR, how to alleviate motion sickness, how to track your controllers. In the beginning with DK1, there was no motion controllers. It was either your keyboard or like an Xbox controller. Um, Razer came up with something. I bought one of these. It was pretty cool. This thing on the bottom here, which was sort of, I guess you could say, it's a precursor to the motion controllers that we see now. These use magnetic. This thing was actually like it generated magnetic field, and the controllers would no, the controllers would be tracked by a magnetic field. So that was really cool, right? It offered up something really interesting. It wasn't great in terms of accuracy, but it sort of offered up a glimpse into the future that we see now. Now we've got something where we've got these really light, relatively light headsets, right? The Meta Quest 2 is pretty comfortable. You've got very light controllers that have like two batteries in them. Oh no, sorry, it's like one AA battery, right? So it's actually really light. Um, there's no need for sensor towers, set up all over the place. This thing is tracking you internally. There's all kinds of sensor fusion magic for them to figure out where your controllers are, even if they're out of sight. To figure out where you are based on what it's seeing from its like 5 cameras. It's also a lot more affordable to develop and consume now, right? Like developing for VR, especially if you're looking at sort of mobile type VR, like the Quest. Developing is relatively cheap in the sense that you're you're not looking at trying to build like these big AAA experiences. You're building stuff that can actually essentially run on an Android phone because that's what the Quest is. Um, and consumption is again very much more affordable now because with this you've got a 300 to 400 USD headset that stands alone. It can run games on its own. You don't need to connect to a PC. You don't need a powerful PC to run anything. Um, so it's a lot more affordable. It's a lot more accessible. The other big thing is that there's been a ton of research now, just over the last few years into user comfort development techniques, interaction techniques, right? And there's a ton of drop-in solutions that you can just, you get like the Oculus SDK, and you've got, locomotion, you've got interactions. Unity has an interaction toolkit where, again, you drop in and you've got cross-device, systems for, all kinds of different locomotion styles. Now, another big one is, you can see on the chart, the usage has grown significantly, right? It's almost on a, I don't know if you can see the end of this. It's growing not linearly, but like it's starting to get sort of exponential, right? So you're looking at a much larger user base as time goes on.